Everyone is talking about the importance of stories and storytelling today, and that's because stories matter. As storytelling consultant Sean Callahan notes, to influence a decision, change the story the decision maker is otherwise likely to intuitively draw upon. And when it comes to climate change, we're all decision makers and we're all accessing stories when faced with a climate relevant decision. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about our personal lifestyle, our company's climate strategy, or who we're going to vote for. As Jonas Sachs might have written as the subtitle to his book Story Wars, why those who tell and live the best climate stories will rule the future. The reason I'm interested in climate stories is because of the nature of the climate change problem. It's commonly termed a wicked problem, and it's perhaps the knottiest communications problem of our time. All sorts of things prevent climate information from translating into the public and private perceptions of and responses to climate change that we might normally think of as appropriate. It turns out from behavioral research that each of us is asking ourselves the same two questions prior to any decision. First, is the topic of the decision worth it to me to engage on? If so, is my decision relevant to the outcome I care about? After all, if it's not, why bother? We each ask ourselves these questions numerous times each day, usually subconsciously. When it comes to answering these questions for climate-relevant decisions, our answers depend on the climate stories we've previously internalized. But here's the problem. The stories that pop up if we're faced by a climate-relevant decision are influenced by lots of different things. We're each unique, with different motivations and life experiences, and we each look at the world through different eyes. This influences the information we're most receptive to in building our climate stories. For example, here are different frames that specific individuals might be most receptive to in terms of how to look at climate change. As a result, the information you would ideally provide to each of these people would be different in most effectively communicating climate change information. So how do we deal with this very tricky communications challenge of getting the most relevant information to all of these different individuals? Generally speaking, we simply deluge everyone with the same information and hope for the best. Whether it's through IPCC reports, hundreds of books, thousands of reports and websites, not to mention nonstop news and blogs, we make a virtual infinity of reports and websites available to pretty much anyone. Basically, we expect each individual to extract the right information for their climate stories. What could possibly go wrong? So how is this communication strategy working out? Well, we have a pretty good idea. Based on public opinion polling by Yale University, we know that people's stories range from alarm over climate change to concern and caution, and ultimately to doubt and dismissiveness. And we have a good sense of how those stories are distributed, at least in the US. This is another way to look at the Yale data. After decades of climate information, our collective answer to the question of, is climate change worth it, is still ambivalent. And unfortunately, we know that these numbers are relatively unchanged over the last 10 years, which, given the deluge of climate information during that time, is a pretty remarkable outcome. So 30 years into the public conversation over climate change, only a fraction of people have internalized climate stories that result in a strong yes response to the question of, is climate change worth it? That has to contribute to the absence of a coordinated societal commitment to tackle climate change in the US. What if, instead of simply deluging everyone with information, we could craft more audience and even individual-specific climate stories? The information with which to do so certainly exists. It's just not getting to the right people in an effective way. If the distribution of public thinking looked like this, we'd be much more effectively tackling climate change. Changing that distribution through targeted climate messaging is what we need to make climate communications all about. What if climate communicators had almost instant access to the information specific audiences would find most relevant? This is the same list we used earlier in the presentation, and it's just a partial list of relevant topics. But where can you go for all of this information today? What if those climate communicators didn't just have access to that information, which in a sense they do through search engines like Google, but they had access to that information organized in multiple ways for multiple audiences, taking advantage of all of the different communications media available today? What if our communicators could present a far more comprehensive climate change picture through the right frame for a specific audience? In the case shown here, the Board of Directors Risk Committee for an electric utility. Would the members of that committee walk out of the room with a different climate story internalized into their future decision-making? Would that new storyline lead to different corporate decisions, strategies, and advocacy efforts on climate change? We're all familiar, I suspect, with the "for want of a nail" proverb. When it comes to more effective climate communications, however, think about this proverb in the reverse. What would be the second, third, and fourth order effects of helping key individuals and audiences internalize better climate stories? As opposed to losing the kingdom, as happens in the proverb, better climate stories could substantially accelerate progress on climate change mitigation.
This is where the Climate Web comes in. We've spent 20,000 hours building the Climate Web to support exactly what I've been describing in the prior slides: development and internalization of better climate stories. The Climate Web incorporates tens of thousands of sources, extracts and links together best available thinking, ideas, and graphics from those sources, and using innovative software on an open access platform allows anyone to explore whatever topic or frame is most relevant to her. This includes the general public, journalists, teachers, consultants, lawyers, and even researchers, and we can support any of these users in most effectively accessing and utilizing the Climate Web knowledge base. Does the Climate Web instantly solve the challenge of climate communications? Of course not. But it's the kind of storytelling resource that has never existed before.
Beyond going in through the front door, here are a few of the ways you can enter the Climate Web. For example, bigquestions.theclimateweb.org, looking at the trillion-dollar climate change questions. Is climate change an emergency? Pulling together all kinds of information relating to conversations around that key question. Is climate change material to your company? Pulling together, again, a lot of the considerations that companies might want to consider in thinking through the issue of business materiality. And last but certainly not least, solving climate change, looking beyond the proverbial streetlight, pulls together a huge amount of information on different kinds of solutions to climate change. So check it out, take advantage of the Climate Web, and work with us to improve the Climate Web. Tackling climate change is way too important to leave to random chance the need to get the right information to the right person at the right time. Thanks.